Thanks very much. Thank you for coming. It's a delight to be here. It's not often someone from Glasgow says that about Edinburgh, but I genuinely mean it. In the title's reasoning about the feeling of others, it'll be almost all about pride, but I thought I didn't want to change the title, and in a way it's part of a larger picture about how we think about and reason about other people's feelings, so that's how it fits in. And so I'll talk for about try and talk for about 45, 50 minutes, and so we have time for questions, but we have to finish at 5 o'clock for on the dot. Right, here we go. There are many cases, I think, where pride is entirely appropriate or legitimate, perfectly good cases of pride. So imagine a child learning to ride a bike and succeeding and then feeling proud about that. Or a teenager who turns the other cheek when they're insulted. In the face of insults, they're proud of their moral response here. The student who gets a first can be proud of that. A retiree looking back on her career of achievement and feeling pride at that object as well. So I take it these are standard, perfectly legitimate cases of pride. Let's call these category 1 cases, C1 cases. There are also cases where pride simply doesn't make sense, and whatever it is you're feeling, it can't be pride. Okay, because there are certain objects that can't be objects of pride and certain relations that don't hold. So an emotional reaction fails to constitute pride. Maybe it's a different kind of emotional reaction, but it just isn't pride. Suppose someone says they're proud of the umlaut. I take it that's whatever you're feeling, you're not proud of the umlaut. Or the fact that people in Calgary own pets. You can't be proud of that. Of nickel plating. If you didn't invent it, you can't be proud of nickel plating. The annual rainfall in Namibia, there's loads of cases of cases where pride is simply inappropriate, and whatever you're feeling, it just isn't pride. Let's call these category C2 cases. So far I take it relatively uncontroversial. I want to focus on a different category of case, which seems in one sense legitimate, as in the objects of pride are, well, they're objects of pride. So pride in a sense makes sense, but there's something normatively suspect about these cases, or at least it strikes me that there's something normatively suspect about these cases. If you don't, this is going to be a real, even more boring talk. But I think there's certain cases which aren't like category 1 cases, but they're not category 2 either, because they're genuine cases of pride, but there's something a bit dubious about them. So what cases appear to be genuine pride, but we might wonder about the appropriateness of these things. I'm proud that Glasgow University has a venerable history, a glorious history. One of the oldest universities in the world, University of Adam Smith, University of Francis Hutcheson, Thomas Reid, etc. I'm proud of that, because I teach at Glasgow University. I'm proud that my grandfather was landlord at Band on the Wall, which is a venerable Manchester music institution. I'm proud of that fact. It was my granddad, and he was the landlord there. I'm proud that I'm not posh, something I'm proud of. And, well, maybe I used to be proud about my boyish complexion. These are all things that you might think, well, you can be proud of these things, but I think there might be something of category 3 cases which you might think is a little bit dubious, normatively dubious, about these kinds of cases here. Okay. So they're understandable, but I think, well, I'm reticent, and maybe other people are reticent as well, to think that they're normatively equivalent to, have the same normative standard as C1 cases. So if you share that intuition, you think that there's something a bit dubious about these cases. Why is this? That's a puzzle, and it's a puzzle I want to talk about today. What's the difference normatively between C1 and C3 cases, if you share the intuition that there's something a bit dubious about these? So I'm going to look at 2 answers that might be given, and kind of standard answers in the literature, I think, and I'm going to say that, as in the standard philosophical talk, that these don't work, and then I'm going to propose a different solution, which will explain what I think the normative difference between C1 and C cases is. C3 cases, category. Okay, first one is C3 cases are unrelated to agency. That's a standard view that you might have about these cases, and that might kind of have struck you something obvious immediately to say. I think that's not going to work. You might think C3 cases are cases of basking in reflected glory. And since it's normatively suspect to bask in reflected glory, then by the same token, C3 cases are normatively suspect as well. They're cases of pride, but they're akin to, they're similar to, or maybe they're just kinds of cases of basking in reflected glory. I'm going to argue that that doesn't work as well. And I'm going to say C3 cases, the actual explanation for our intuition, or the intuition that lots of us might have. C3 cases are in tension with certain practical or prudential norms that govern our reasoning about the feelings of others. So it's a kind of practical reason that we're dubious about C3 cases. C3 cases can be perfectly legitimate cases of pride, but we're dubious about them for practical reasons. That's what I'm going to argue. Okay, so that's the structure of the paper. Okay, let's get started. First, after the intro, first section, I'm going to say a little bit about what pride is and why, given this picture of pride, C3 cases seem perfectly okay. So that's the first thing I want to do here. Okay, what's pride? Well, here's a standard way of categorizing emotions. This will be familiar to lots of you, and it might be a bit boring, but let's go through it anyway. Emotions are standardly characterized as having a number of components or elements. These look familiar. They include some eliciting perception or thought. You can be emotional just by thinking about things, so it doesn't have to be a perception here. There's some evaluation or appraisal of the object or event that generates the emotion it's directed towards. There's typically bodily and facial changes. And there's affect or feeling, and these are often feeling of the bodily and facial changes here. So there's an element, emotions feel a particular way, they have an affective element. There are cognitive changes. Emotion has effects on memory, has effects on attention, has effects on reasoning, and some of the really interesting talks today have been talking about the cognitive changes and the effects that emotion has on them. So there are cognitive changes typically involved. And there's motivational changes as well. Your mood to do things. Okay. And you might think that these are characteristics, certainly of paradigm cases of emotions. So paradigm cases of emotion involve all of these elements and components. And there might be interesting grey areas here. Is startle an emotion? Well, it doesn't seem to involve much in the way of evaluation or appraisal, but you might think startle might, for some people at least, is an emotion. Boredom, is that an emotion? Well, it doesn't have a motivational tendency. You just sat there. Or maybe you moved to get out of the room. But you might think, some people think boredom's an emotion. Maybe it's not a paradigmatic emotion, but paradigm cases of emotion have all of these. And typically emotions are often distinguished in terms of their characteristic appraisal structure. That's one good way of telling emotions apart. And I think pride is an emotion, and you can just come up with your own components of pride by going through this list. I'm not going to do it, but you might think that pride has all of these elements. And therefore the interesting question, or one interesting question, is what's the appraisal structure of pride? What's the core relational theme that's characteristic of feelings of pride that we can appeal to in order to distinguish pride from these other emotions, and which we might use to assess the appropriateness or legitimacy or rationality of pride? Okay. So moral wrongdoing is the characteristic appraisal structure for guilt, or the core relational theme. Other blame is for anger. So what's the characteristic component or appraisal correlational theme when it comes to pride? Well, here's a nice quote from Gabrielle Taylor. I know someone mentioned before, it was a really nice presentation because it didn't have loads of text. So this does have loads of text, and it doesn't have any pictures. But anyway, so here's a long quote, but I'll read it and I'll try and be a bit slow. Here's what Gabrielle Taylor says. A person who experiences pride believes that she stands in the relation of belonging to some object, person, deed, state, which she thinks is desirable in some respect. It is because, in her view, this relation holds between her and the desirable object that she believes her worth to be increased in the relevant respect. This belief is constitutive of the feeling of pride. The gap between the explanatory and identificatory beliefs is bridged by the belief that her connection to the thing in question is itself of value or an achievement of hers. So says Taylor in a famous account of what pride is. Now, there's three central elements of this account, given this quote. One is that pride is a relation or response to some object or event of value. That seems to be an essential element in feeling proud of something, that it has to be directed towards something that you at least think is of value. So that's one element of this. It's a response to some object or event of value. And as the quote by Taylor nicely brings out, the object or event of value has to be something that you are related to. And there's interesting questions about the nature of this kind of relation. Taylor's got a kind of broad category, broad relation here. She thinks it's belonging. And that's why she thinks you might be proud of your country, because you belong. In the broad sense to the country. You might be proud of your ancestors, because in some kind of relation of belonging, you belong to the same family. Okay, so the object or event must stand in some relation to us, and this is a relation of, for Taylor, belonging, which is a pretty broad relation in her view. That's not enough for pride. You need something else as well. You need to think that this relation bears positively with respect to your self-worth. It enhances your self-worth. So the proud person must regard her standing in this relation as something that is itself of value, as a source of self-worth or self-esteem. So those are the main elements of Taylor's picture. Given this account, it's kind of easy to see why cases of C1, category C1 cases are cases of pride. Because you might think that learning to ride a bike is valuable for a kid. And it stands in some relation to them. They're the one that learned how to do it. And it enhances their self-worth or self-esteem. They're now someone who can ride a bike. So just run through the C1 cases. You'll see those elements are apparent. And similarly with C2 cases. Clearly you can see why these aren't appropriate objects of pride. The umlaut's valuable. I mean, you need the umlaut. Nothing to do with me. It has no relation of belonging to me. And that's why I can't be proud of the umlaut, nor of nickel plating. Nor of rainfall in Namibia. Because even if these things are valuable in some sense, they lack any kind of relation of belonging to me. And even if there is a relation, it doesn't bear positively on my self-worth or self-esteem. So that's why C2 cases can't be cases of pride, given Taylor's nice account of what pride is. Okay, but C3 cases do count on this view of what pride is as genuine cases of pride. There's something valuable about running a venerable Manchester music venue. That's a value given Manchester's glorious musical history. I mean, I belong to the same family as my grandfather, so there's a relation of belonging there. And it reflects well on me. I mean, I bang on about this when I go to Manchester. I'm out in my granddad used to run that, you know. And sort of beam and everyone, oh, Brady's granddad used to, you know. So that, I mean, I get kudos from that kind of thing. And you might think other cases as well. If you're in Glasgow, then it's valuable not to be posh. And that reflects well on you if you're not posh in Glasgow. Your self-worth and self-esteem is enhanced. So the other cases are cases of something that's valuable, and they belong to you, and it reflects well on your self-esteem. So C3 cases are perfectly okay given Taylor's account. Okay. So why be suspicious of them? Why think, if you do share the intuition, that there's something normatively suspect, if given Taylor's popular account and plausible account of what pride is, they're perfectly fine. Okay, so here's two attempts that I think are going to fail, and here's one attempt, my attempt, that I think is going to work. So the first one is the relation of pride and agency. So here's one thing that you might be tempted to say. Sidgwick, Solomon, Christensen all have an account of pride that stresses that agency is really important for legitimate or appropriate pride. Indeed, for pride to be for your feeling to be a feeling of pride in the first place. So it has to have something to do with your agency. So those who accept an agential account of pride have a really simple explanation of why C3 cases are not appropriate, because they're not cases of pride at all. That's why there's something normatively suspect about saying, I'm proud of these things, because you can't be proud of them. Why? Because they're unrelated to your agency in the right kind of way. Here's a quote from Jeremy Fisher in a recent paper talking about the agency account. According to this account, says Fisher, the self and the object of pride are suitably related just in case one is morally responsible for the existence or excellence of the object of one's pride. According to the agency account, the self and the object of pride are suitably related. That's the kind of relation. It's not the broad one of belonging. It's much narrower than that. Just in case one is morally responsible for the existence or excellence of the object of one's pride. So C3 cases aren't cases of pride at all, given this. I mean, I'm a member of Glasgow University. It's my institution. But it doesn't have a long and venerable history because of me. I didn't do anything to ensure that it's one of the oldest universities in the world. Nor did I do anything to ensure that my grandfather was the landlord of the Band on the Wall. And despite my rigorous beauty regime, you know, I'm not responsible for my boyish complexion. Et cetera, et cetera. So in a way, you lack the relation of agency here, and therefore you can't be proud of these things, given the agential account. They're not really cases of pride at all. Why think this account's plausible, and lots of people do? Sidgwick, Solomon, Christensen. You might think, well, certainly it seems true that you merit praise and esteem if you're morally responsible for something. Certainly you merit blame only if you're morally responsible for that thing as well. Lots of people think that's really plausible. So you think the positive account of that is you might think you only merit or deserve praise or esteem for what you are in a relevant way morally responsible for. Since I'm not morally responsible for any of those other things, I don't merit or deserve praise or esteem for them, and therefore they can't enhance I can't think of them in those ways, and therefore they can't enhance my self-worth and self-esteem. That's one reason why you might take the agency account to be plausible. So if esteem and responsibility are linked in this way, thoughts about self-worth and self-esteem will be linked to things for which one is responsible. So I can't really think that my grandfather, being the landlord, enhances my self-worth, because it's nothing that I'm responsible for. If esteem and responsibility have this link, then my thoughts can't be directed to things for which I'm not responsible. So I can't really think that my self-worth is enhanced, or that a person can't think that she merits esteem for things that she's not responsible for. That's why you can't feel pride towards these category 3 objects or events. Okay. So that's one attempted explanation of the illegitimacy of being proud of these things. Is it a good explanation? I don't think so. Tons wrong with that. But one thing that might be kind of obvious. Look, even if you think that praise is tied to responsibility in some way, and blame is tied to responsibility, such that you're rightly esteemed and blamed for good, bad things, responsible for, why think you can be only esteemed for such things? Why on earth should we accept that? People say that kind of thing when they've not got an argument. But it's just surely, clearly, you can be esteemed for things that you're not responsible for. At least our practices of praising and blaming, and certainly praising and esteeming people, don't tie into things that they're responsible for. So even if praise is tied to responsibility in one direction, you don't think the other direction holds. People are praised and esteemed for good looks, ready wit, physical stature, athletic ability. And it's not weird that people are praised and esteemed for these things. It seems perfectly legitimate and appropriate to praise someone for their ready wit, to praise someone for their good looks. It's not inappropriate. It seems perfectly okay. Certainly social standing, which is a major cause of self-worth and self-esteem, social standing is often unrelated to your agency. And your social standing can really affect how well you feel about yourself. So since social standing can be enhanced as a result of things for which we're not responsible, in certain, being from the right family can be really important to self-esteem and your social standing in certain universities. It's really important that you're from the right family, and this matters to you, and it matters to your self-esteem. Since your social standing can depend upon things that, it's nothing to do with you that you're in that family, then you might think that we can be praised and therefore we can be proud of these things even if we have no relation to agency. Okay. So if self-esteem partly depends on social standing, it too can depend upon things which are in the relevant way beyond our control. Okay, so I don't think the agential account is going to be plausible. At least, well, we'll come back to the agential account right at the end, because there's something to do with agency that's going to be important here. But I don't think agency is the condition for appropriate or legitimate pride, or for something to be an object of pride in the first place. I don't think that can be quite right. But hold the thought of agency in mind. It will prove to be important in a bit. Okay, so that's the first attempt, and that's the response. I think there's a better response in the offering that we'll look at in a little while when we look at cases of basking in reflected glory, which is the second kind of response I want to talk about. Here's what we might do instead. Cast doubt on C3 cases by employing a companions in guilt strategy. They're dubious, they're normatively suspect, because they're just like things which are, I think, unarguably dubious or normatively suspect. And those are cases of basking in reflected glory. So they're akin to, or kinds of, cases where someone basks in reflected glory. And these really aren't inappropriate. You ought not to do that. You ought not to be the kind of football supporter who just changes their team every year depending on who wins the league. You ought not to be a glory hunter or a Johnny-come-lately kind of football supporter. You all know that. And you ought to know that with regard to lots of other things as well. You ought not to be basking in reflected glory. If these cases of pride are like that, then you ought not to feel pride in these things as well. Okay. Here's a nice quote by Robert Cialdini. To explain the sense in which people take credit for the success of others. They think that it reflects well on them. That's what it is to bask in reflected glory. People appear to feel that they can share in the glory of a successful other with whom they are in some sense associated. One manifestation of this feeling is a public trumpeting of the association. Here, a simple case of affiliation is sufficient to stimulate a public announcement of the critical connection. Someone else is successful, you say you have some connection with that successful person and seem to take credit for this. You bask in their glory, not your own, nothing that you've done. And it happens all the time. So apparently state officials in Indiana, certainly when he wrote this, there used to be a boast of theirs that more vice presidents come from this state than any other. Yeah, but that was the case. Indiana were really, really, bigging that up. People in Edinburgh of a certain generation, older people, might boast that Sean Connery was their milkman. You don't know that Sean Connery was a milkman in Edinburgh? He was. And you talk to anyone over a certain age in Edinburgh, I bet they guarantee Sean Connery, he delivered milk to us. That's the bask in reflected glory. My own case, Rod Stewart once bought me a pint. There you go. There's something, they're common and they are dubious. They're normatively suspect. So therefore, category 3 cases are normatively suspect because they're just like cases like this. Cases where you don't have any, I'm basking in reflected glory when I keep telling people my grandfather used to run the band on the wall. But I don't think this is going to work either because I think there's important differences, really important differences between C3 cases and basking in reflected glory cases. And this is going to turn, again, back to some things that Fisher says about the agential account, but I think there's an interesting explanation of what pride involves. And it involves more than mere agency here. There can be legitimate but non-agential cases of pride. And these are not cases of basking in reflected glory. Okay. Here's what Fisher says. Certain non-agential connections with valuable goods are legitimate sources of pride because they reflect personal ideals. And so you can be proud of something that you didn't have responsibility for bringing about. There's no agential connection. If that thing is a really important or central part of your personal ideal, your self-conception, who you think you are. So that's a way in which you can have legitimate pride that isn't agential. So says Fisher. And there's something really plausible about that, I think. So here's another quote from Tracy, Sheriff and Cheng. Pride is elicited when individuals appraise a positive event as relevant to their identity. That is, their most important self-representations and their goals for their identity. That is, their ideal self-representations. So pride isn't just related to things you're responsible for. The objects and events are appraised as relevant to their identity and their goals. So their self-conception and their idealized self-conception. Okay. So appropriate pride and self-esteem seem dependent upon this conception of the relation between the object and you, such that you might not be morally responsible for it, but it's part of who you are. And in that way you might think you can be proud of being a real American. Why? Because that's really important for who you are. Okay, even though it's not something you're morally responsible for, people might legitimately say that they're proud of that. That's the kind of idea being pushed here. Okay, so appropriate pride and self-esteem seem dependent on the satisfaction of one's personal ideals. These are self-conceptions under which we value ourselves. And C3 cases therefore seem to be perfectly okay and very different from cases of basking in reflected glory, given this. After all, ideal of belonging to a venerable institution, or to a city with a glorious musical tradition, or solidarity with a social class. These are all things that can be an important part of one's self-identity. You regard yourself as an academic, and it's important to you that your institution has a long and glorious history. That matters to you. Why? Because it matters to who you think you are and the conception under which you value yourself. And similarly with the other C3 cases. So that's why they might be legitimate and rather different from cases where you bask in reflected glory. The fact that Sean Connery was your milkman, that ought not to be any part of anyone's self-identity. Or, there's no kind of self-conception under which you value yourself, the fact that Sean Connery was your milkman or that Rod Stewart once bought you a pint. I mean, that's purely basking in reflected glory. They're not C3 cases, because they have nothing to do with your self-conception. Okay. So cases of basking in reflective glory do not have this relation to something you might think that's important for pride, that it reflects identity. The fact that Connery was your milkman is not part of a self-conception under which you regard your life as having value. Okay, so the point here isn't one about agency. It's about how plausible it is to see some relation of belonging as central to who you are. And if you can legitimately say that, you make the case, then it's perfectly okay to be proud of that thing. That's why you can have perfectly appropriate non-agential pride. Okay. So two accounts don't work, but I think there's plausible elements in each. I'm going to take a different tack now and look at a different kind of account of what pride is. And on this account, pragmatic and prudential considerations will be much more important when we reason about the feelings of others and might explain why we think there's a normative difference between C1 and C3 cases, even if C3 cases are perfectly okay. That's a weird conclusion, but the idea is we think there's something dubious about them, even if they're perfectly okay as cases of pride. How do we explain that? Well, let's have a look at a different account of pride, and this is a social functionalist account of what pride is. If something like this account's true, then I think we have an explanation of why C1 cases are perfectly fine, C3 cases might be regarded as, for good reason, might be regarded as dubious. Okay. Social functionalist accounts aim to explain emotions by reference to the social functions that have evolved or perhaps been created to serve. So that's the core message of these kinds of accounts of emotions. They aim to explain emotions by reference, not necessarily to the core components. It's the kind of traditional analytic way of here's what an emotion is, it has these components, this appraisal structure. If you're a social functionalist account, you say, well, what do emotions do? What goals do they serve? Let's have a look at those and then define emotions in terms of those, or at least identify emotions in terms of those. And the quote before from Tracy, Sheriff and Cheng, who looked at a lot of the social psychological literature, and they conclude that pride has evolved to serve a particular function. And there's a bunch of evidence that they survey for this. One is they think that the facial expression of pride is displayed by individuals across cultures, in the same context and in the same situations, and they think this is pretty good evidence that it has evolved. I'm going to just take this account and assume it's correct, partly because I think it explains the C1, C3 cases. There might be loads of reasons why you think their account's wrong, but it has an air of plausibility, I think. So pride has evolved to serve a particular function, and given evidence for this, you have the same facial expression, and some further studies, they looked at cases of Olympic and Paralympic Games, where sighted and blind athletes spontaneously display the same kind of facial expression in response to victory. And you might think an explanation for that, well, it can't be that the blind athletes have seen the face and have learned the kind of expression to make, because they can't have seen it. But nevertheless, they show exactly the same kind of facial expression in response to victory. Okay, so they cite these kinds of studies here. On their view, pride has a particular function or purpose. Pride expression is likely to have evolved, they think, to serve a distal function related to the situation in which pride occurs, namely success. When you've been successful, then you express pride. And pride expression, the facial expression of pride, serves a particular goal or function in these circumstances. What is that function? They think it's to enhance your social status. Pride has evolved, they think, to serve the distal function of enhancing social status, and in particular, to help individuals transform culturally valued achievements into higher social status. To signal to others that you've achieved something, and thereby enhance and improve your self-worth and self-esteem. That's the point of the facial expression of pride. It's signaling to others that you've done something that merits enhanced reputation. To help individuals transform culturally valued achievements into higher social status. Okay, so that's the line. And they think that pride does this in at least two ways. One will be, one seems plausible, but I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on the second one, the mere expression, facial expression of pride. So pride does this in a couple of ways, and the first one will be kind of familiar. Pride motivates individuals to strive for achievement in socially valued domains. Why? Well, one reason for this is that pride is, as we know, feelings of pride are pleasurable, and pleasure is a positive reinforcer. So seeking pleasure gets you to do things, to engage in practices with socially valued goals as the result. So pride is pleasurable, and pleasure is a positive reinforcer here. So here's what this does, the motivational element of pride, on their view. The subject will strive to develop an identity that coheres with social norms. And they think individuals who are successful in this pursuit are in turn rewarded with social approval, acceptance, and an increased social status, all of which, on their view, promote adaptive fitness. Again, it's an evolutionary account. So pride motivates you to achieve things that are valued in the particular society, and as a result of achieving these things, you are rewarded. Social approval, acceptance, increased social status, and this makes you, this promotes adaptive fitness. Okay, so that's one of the things that pride does because it's pleasurable, and pleasure is a positive reinforcer. The one I'm going to focus on is to do with expression of pride. And mere expression of pride can enhance social status. Pride has a universally recognized non-verbal expression, and the point of this, to repeat, is to inform observers, other social group members, of the proud individual's achievement, indicating that he or she deserves higher status. They merit increases in their status. Okay. So Tiedens and colleagues, 2000, found that individuals who are believed to be experiencing pride are assumed by others to be high status, suggesting an intuitive association between others' perceptions of pride and status. You see someone displaying pride and you automatically assume that they are higher status. That's what facial expression of pride does. And the author's own studies use the implicit association test, again found that pride expression is rapidly and automatically perceived as a signal of high status. So there's some evidence that that's what pride does. Signals to others that you've achieved and enhances your status in that way. Now clearly such signals can be of value to the person displaying pride. This person, after all, stands to receive increased resources, attention, and other status-related benefits. So the person who displays pride stands to benefit from that display. So it's not a motivational story, it's an expressive story. You express pride, people give you increased resources, attention, and other kinds of benefits. Okay, that's one thing that signalling can do. But clearly signalling can benefit observers as well. It helps you to know who the achievers are. To achieve stuff you need various virtues. You need fortitude, courage, patience, dexterity, hard work. It's good to know who those people are. So it's good for you to know who the people are who've achieved stuff. It's good for you to recognise in their expression that they have achieved stuff. So signalling can benefit the person who signals. It can also benefit observers as well. Those who rapidly and automatically perceive the subject as higher status can more effectively, they say, navigate the status hierarchy by showing appropriate deference, knowing whom to emulate, forming productive alliances, and facilitating their own status jockeying. If you know who the achievers are, then you can deal with them, and this can be good for you as an observer. Okay. So display of pride has benefits for the person feeling pride, and also has benefits for the people observing them. Now, I think the social functionalist account of pride, this kind of story can explain the difference between our assessment of C1 and C3 cases, to show why we think C1 are perfectly good and C3 cases might be dubious normatively, or at least they don't have the same normative status. So thinking there's something normatively amiss with C3 cases arguably results from a practical solution to a practical problem, a particular problem to do with pride's expression. The fact that pride has potential benefits to the person feeling pride and to the observer might seem like a good thing, but it generates a particular practical problem, and we need a solution to that problem. Here's why. Another big chunk of text, apologies. If non-verbal expression of pride is rapidly and automatically perceived as a signal of high status, if their story is correct, and can, as a result, function to inform others that you merit praise and esteem. There's good reason, good pro tanto reason, from your standpoint, to come to feel and express pride towards an extended and expanded range of objects and events. Makes sense. If expressing pride gets you benefits, then you should feel proud about more things. Why? Because you'll get more benefits. You'll get higher social standing. Your self-worth and self-esteem will be enhanced as a result. So you've got good reason, given this account of facial expression of pride, to extend the range of things that you can be proud about. So you'll be thus under normative pressure to regard an extended range of objects and events as legitimate targets of pride. There's some normative pressure that way. And this is really important for your self-worth and self-esteem, that it's enhanced. But interestingly, you might think that it explains a tendency to extend the range of objects of pride if you've got little else to be proud of. Why? Because, well, if you're not signaling your own achievements to other people, then you might think you run the risk of social isolation and social rejection. Your self-esteem's lowered and people don't want to deal with you because you're a loser, roughly. And that's not crazy to think that happens. If you think about the psychology of people who express, be careful saying this, pride in their country, or certain kinds of people. If you think about what's behind the people who support Britain First, one, virulent, despicable racism, but also you look at these people and think there's not much else going on in their life. So they extend the range of their concern and say, proud of Britain. I can be proud of that. And their self-esteem within their group is enhanced, so they think. And they are no longer fearing social rejection and isolation. So you might think this tendency to do that, to extend the range of things, to be proud of one's country, to be proud of things you have no agential relationship to. You've got good reason to do this from this perspective. So this might be especially pronounced if the subject has little to feel proud about when it comes to her own achievements and agency. Because the threat of social isolation is a genuine psychological factor in getting people to feel proud about things like country. That's one explanation. I'm not saying that's true of everyone who feels proud of the country. There can be perfectly good reasons, legitimate reasons, all kinds of reasons. But I think that's one explanation. Okay. But there's normative pressure from the other direction as well. So there's normative pressure on you to expand the range of things you can be proud about. But there's also, as an observer, there's normative pressure on you to check whether the person really has achieved something. After all, I mean, if you're in the business of giving attention and resources to people who you think have achieved, then you better make sure that they have achieved something. Otherwise, you're wasting attention and resources on people who don't merit it. The mere fact that they express and you automatically perceive them as higher status doesn't mean you necessarily endorse that judgment. You might hold off until you do some investigating. Well, I know they're looking really proud, but ought I to devote time and attention, engage in status jockeying around that person? Well, not if they're not worth it. So there's pressure from the other direction, which might ground skepticism about C3 cases. Benefits to the subject displaying pride might equally be regarded as costs to the observer who esteems them. That seems true. It only makes sense for you as an observer to share resources and convey esteem if the person really does merit praise and a high status. No point doing this from your self-interested standpoint if the person doesn't merit these things. And it only makes sense for an observer to show deference to, emulate, form alliances with, engage in status jockeying around. Do you engage in status jockeying around? Anyway, the proud person, if such things are also worth it for the observer. Don't go in for these things unless you benefit, unless you stand. You've got a good chance to benefit from these kinds of things. Otherwise, it's a waste of your resources, and you ought not to be doing it. So it makes sense for an observer to do this only if you're sure, if you can come up with judgments of genuine merit and not rely automatically on your initial emotional appraisals here. Okay. So there's normative pressure on you to express pride in a bunch of things. Why? Because you stand to gain that way, but there's normative pressure on observers to restrict the class because you don't want to be wasting all of your resources on people who aren't worth it, so to speak. So there's normative pressure on observers to refrain from doing things that might benefit the proud person unless there's good reason to think that the person merits an enhanced reputation and the attendant benefits. So we're in a problematic situation. We have a normative arms race between individuals who wish to expand the category of legitimate objects of pride for reasons of self-esteem and enhanced social status, and observers who wish to restrict this expansion for prudential reasons of their own. Normative pressure from two directions. This kind of problem is mirrored in a bunch of cases. It's certainly mirrored when we think about expression of pain. And it has a similar problematic structure. Expressions of pain can have significant value to those in pain and to observers. As observers, it's really important, I suppose you're a close, tightly knit group, to know if someone's in pain. Really important to you. Really important to know if you're in a boxing match, if you know the other person's in pain. That's kind of valuable information. But it can have significant value to those who are in pain because you get assistance and sympathy and care and attention. And it's also good for observers if you're part of the group. We need to know who's healthy and who's not. Okay. So expression of pain can have significant value. And there's some normative pressure for subjects to display pain behaviour, even when they're not in pain, given these benefits. Or to exaggerate pain expressions in cases when they are, when at least in the presence of allies, when you stand to benefit by gaining things from helpful allies. So there's thus a prima facie case that doing so will enhance the subject's chances of receiving the right kind of resources in the form of assistance, sympathy, care and attention. Some normative pressure to exaggerate, given the benefits you can get from expressing pain. Okay. But as you know, there's normative pressure for observers to limit their provision of these goods to only those who merit or deserve them. You don't want to be fooled by people tricking you or who are exaggerating. And so there's something of a normative arms race here as well. There's normative pressure on the subject to enhance, to increase the cases where you express or exaggerate pain and pain behaviour, and normative pressure on the observer to resist this, given the high costs of giving all these things to the person who engages in this kind of behaviour. Okay. How do we solve these problems? From a practical standpoint, what do we do given this normative arms race in the case of pride and in the case of pain? Well, let's have a look at pain first and see typically what we do to solve this as observers. So how do we solve this? Here's a case where it seems obvious that people have adopted a certain practical standard and they rely to it. Not just in this particular case, but you think about it all over the place. One important area where those who observe pain expression adopt a particular practical measure in order to restrict judgments of merit is medicine. There's pressure on the person to exaggerate their pain. There's pressure on people who are prescribing physicians to restrict the amount of medicine they prescribe. Okay. So it's not uncommon for the gatekeepers of medical resources, namely the prescribing physicians, to give pain-killing medication to a limited class of those who are displaying pain behaviour, namely the ones who are injured, the ones where there's clear evidence of injury or damage. That's how, notoriously, doctors behave. They're very reticent to prescribe painkillers unless there's evidence that you are genuinely suffering physical damage. As you know. Doctors do it, but we do it. We do it as well. So physicians adopt this, importantly, physicians adopt this strategy, knowing full well, because they're physicians, they're smart, that there's loads of cases of pain that are not related or correlated with bodily injury. neuropathic pain, chronic pain. All of these pains, headaches, migraine headaches, no bodily injury, and yet utterly terrible. So there's loads of cases of pain that aren't correlated with bodily injury, and yet doctors are reticent to prescribe in these cases. Knowing full well that there are these cases, they're reticent to prescribe. So physicians do that, doctors do that, we do that as well. Parents, stop crying, you're not hurt. Stop crying. Parents do that. Colleagues. You have colleagues who get kind of ill around about marking time? Flatmates who get ill when it's their time to do the dishes or take the bins out or go do the weekly shop. How do we respond in those cases when they profess that they're ill? If you're anything like me, you say, you don't look ill. That's what we say. Oh, I'm really ill. You don't look it. Implication, you're not ill. Why? Because there's no correlation between your claims about illness and what I can see. If you're not looking it, if there's no evidence of bodily damage or distress here, you're not getting out of the, house duties. You're not getting out of the marking. You say you're ill, but I know you. You're that kind of colleague. Parents do it. Colleagues, we do it with colleagues, we do it with flatmates. It's a policy that we have. Don't give resources if people don't display signs of injury or illness. Because you don't want to be ripped off. You don't want to be made a fool of. That's the strategy we engage. Okay, something similar I think is going on with pride. And this might explain the difference between C1 and C3 cases. Okay, so we can identify a similar pragmatic strategy in the case of pride. And here we return to the first attempted solution. Because here the readily identifiable measure is agency, I think. That's why we think C1 cases, where there's agency, are legitimate and C3 cases aren't. Even if we're fully aware that certain kinds of non-agential pride are perfectly appropriate. We're less inclined to give resources to regard them as appropriate, given the potential costs. So regarding them as dubious is a way of solving that practical problem, just as what we do with colleagues and flatmates. Regarding them as faking it, unless we see evidence, is a way of dealing with that normative arms race there as well. So observers use this measure to safeguard against exploitation, despite knowing, being fully aware, because maybe their own objects of pride are like this, despite knowing that sometimes expressions of pride that reflect reduced agency ideals are perfectly legitimate, but you're not inclined to regard them as such, given the normative pressure to safeguard resources and to safeguard against exploitation. And this is a tendency we internalise. We do it in the case of pain expression, and I think we do it in the case of pride expression as well, and this explains, I think, the perception that there's a normative difference here. So by internalising a tendency to endorse only those perceptions of enhanced status that reflect agency, we lower the risk of wasting our resources on those who don't merit them. And by the same token, raise the possibility of our benefiting from forming alliances with the proud person. And if they brought something about through their own agency, then at least you can be sure that they have the virtues necessary, reasonably sure that they have the virtues necessary to bring that about. So you stand to benefit. It's a more reliable way of you benefiting if you focus on agency. It's something they've done, even if they can be perfectly proud of things that are non-agential. So by internalising a tendency to endorse only those perceptions of enhanced status that reflect agency and responsibility, we lower the risk of wasting our resources. This isn't to say that agential conceptions are the correct conceptions of appropriate or legitimate pride, but it is to say that that's the factor that explains our thinking that there's something dubious about non-agential conceptions, even if they're perfectly okay. Okay. Conclusion. Began with a puzzle, how to explain the intuitive normative difference between C1 and C3 cases. Appealing to agency in and of itself to say that C3 cases are not legitimate, this isn't going to do it. Because I think they're perfectly legitimate non-agential conceptions. Nor will associating C3 cases with basking in reflected glory. There's genuine differences between these cases as well. But I think there are pragmatic or prudential reasons to link our esteem of others, our deference to them, and all of the other goods to agency. There's good pragmatic or practical reasons for us to do that, just as there are in the case of pain and pain expression. So it's good policy to regard C3 cases, practical policy, as somehow normatively suspect, even if they can be perfectly legitimate forms of pride. Okay, thank you.